Nazi bombs rained on Britain with terrible certainty in 1940. But just as certain was the voice that rose in defiance.
You ask what is our policy? I will say it is to wage war by sea, land, and air, with all our might, with all the strength that God can give us, to wage war against a monstrous tyranny never surpassed in the dark and lamentable catalogue of human crime. That is our policy.
Brilliant, arrogant, and energetic, Winston Churchill led the nation he loved throughout World War II, when Britain's very existence was threatened.
If Churchill had died in 1939, he would have gone down to posterity as a marvellously colourful, astonishingly talented man with many elements of greatness, but whose career had somehow never come off.
It's one of the great ironies of his life that he owed his great opportunity to Hitler. And in fact, Hitler himself said, if this war had not come, who then would speak of Churchill?
On his 80th birthday, Churchill looked back on the war years and said,
It was the nation and the race dwelling all round the globe that had the lion's heart. I had the luck to be called upon to give the roar.
In 1933, Adolf Hitler was winning international acclaim as Germany's new chancellor, while Winston Churchill was an out-of-power politician with a reputation for warmongering and bad judgment.
It's difficult to remember now how badly Churchill was viewed in the 1930s before the great events of the Second World War. Most people in Britain saw him as a washed-up has-been. He was in his 60s, he hadn't been in power for the best part of a decade. A lot of people thought he had the wrong views about Germany. A lot of people thought he was drunk all the time. Most people thought the idea of him returning to power wouldn't happen, and that if it did, it would be pretty dreadful.
But Churchill was one of the first to denounce Hitler's ferocious drive for conquest and his intense racial hatred.
Churchill thought that this is a man who can galvanize the Germans, who felt resentful that they lost the First World War and that they were unfairly and badly treated, and that Germany was ready to rise again, and here is a man who can do that and lead them.
After Germany annexed Austria, Churchill decided to mix wit with warnings.
He said once, the British ruling class continues to take its weekends in the country, while Hitler is taking his countries on the weekend.
But the British government ignored him.
He was really considered to be the boy who cried wolf at every threat. But as the Nazi threat became increasingly serious, he became connected in people's minds with the idea of total resistance to the Nazis.
The problem was that the Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, who became Prime Minister in 1937, didn't like Churchill, believed that he, Chamberlain, could get on good terms with Nazi Germany, permanent good terms with Nazi Germany.
The next year, Germany swallowed up part of Czechoslovakia. An anxious Chamberlain met with Hitler, who promised no more invasions. Chamberlain returned from Germany proudly waving a signed agreement.
I bring you peace with honor. I believe it is peace in our time.
But on September 1st, 1939, Hitler smashed Europe's dreams of peace and attacked Poland. The Second World War had begun. 2 days later, a shaken Chamberlain asked Churchill, whose dire warnings about Hitler had come true, to join his cabinet.
He was the one who could embrace war when war was essential, and Chamberlain was someone who wanted to avoid war at all costs, which led him astray when he came up against someone like Hitler.
On May 10th, 1940, Nazi Germany simultaneously attacked Holland, Belgium, and France.
The Germans invaded in what was called blitzkrieg, a massive armored attack, armored and air attack, including vicious bombing of civilians trying to flee on the roads in order to create chaos on the roads so the armies couldn't penetrate. A very cruel attack.
That same day, Chamberlain resigned and Churchill received a royal summons. He left Buckingham Palace as Britain's new Prime Minister. He turned to his bodyguard with tears in his eyes and said, "I only hope it's not too late, but we'll do our best."
He was confronted simply with a whole series of hammer blows of reversals and defeats and problems. And as he said, he awoke with dread in his heart.
3 days after he became Prime Minister, the speech when he says that he has nothing to offer but sweat, toil, and tears and blood. I think it was a great speech. He said what was true. He said nothing to offer. Things are pretty rotten bad.
It seemed very likely that before long Hitler would be dominating the whole of the continent of Europe, and no one at that point thought that Britain's prospects looked very good. In fact, most people thought that Britain's prospects looked very bad, and many people thought that Britain's prospects looked even worse now this madcap adventurer Churchill was in charge.
Britain's future and the history of the world would hinge on what Churchill did next. The terrifying choice he faced was one for which he believed his entire eventful life had prepared him.
He once used a phrase, he was being attacked in the House of Commons. My experience, he said, which has been bought, not taught. Now, as he hadn't learnt it from books, it had been bought at great expense through actually having to do these things in the past. And I think that's what, if you like, tempered the steel.
The tempering began very early. Born in 1874, Winston was the first son of Lord and Lady Randolph Churchill. Lord Randolph's cruel wit and arrogance not only led to his own political downfall, but deeply hurt Winston.
Churchill's relationship to his father is one of the most poignant parts of his life. He worshipped his father. His father was a brilliant politician, but very erratic.
His father thought he was no good for anything. And the father said, "You're only fit to go into the army class." And from his first day as a soldier, he not only dreamed, but worked to become a politician.
Churchill's path to politics took him to the ends of the British Empire and beyond, as a soldier and war correspondent. Ambitious and fearless, young Winston hopped from one colonial hotspot to the next: Cuba, Sudan, India, and South Africa.
He talked about the fascinating thrills of war, and he bragged to his mother in a letter about shooting men at close range in the face. But as he got older, he had an increasing sense of the destructiveness of war.
Yet it was one of his war stories that made Churchill a national hero and helped him win his first election victory in 1900 at age 26. Churchill's skill with words soon came in even more handy as Europe inched toward what would become the First World War.
In his very first speech to Parliament, all of them were older than he was. Some of them were 30 years, 40 years older. He warned them that they had no idea how terrible a European war would be. He said, "You're talking glibly about war, because they were debating military finances." Well, some of them, their palms sweated when they listened to this young man. They realized there's something in what he's saying.
From the beginning of his political career, Churchill's speeches made a powerful impression, both positive and negative. But public speaking did not come easily.
He began life with a stammer. He was unprepossessing physically, so that he lacked the kind of natural gifts and high-level education which were normally expected to be necessary if you were to become a great orator. So Churchill simply had to work very hard at it, laboriously enlarging his vocabulary, practicing, giving public speeches, and writing out and then dictating out his speeches word for word.
By 1911, Churchill was on the fast track to the top of British politics as First Lord of the Admiralty. Never one to hide his feelings or opinions, he made some enemies along the way. British suffragists, whose civil disobedience tactics he criticized, and his own political party, the Conservatives, which he quit and then loudly denounced. In 1914, the European war Churchill had warned against swept those squabbles aside, then settled into a massive, blood-soaked stalemate. Germany and its allies fought Britain and France on the Western Front and Russia in the east. Churchill, as head of the Navy, proposed a bold move to knock the Turkish Ottoman Empire out of the war. Send the Royal Navy to a narrow body of water in Turkey called the Dardanelles and bomb the Ottomans' coastal forts. His plan would lead to disaster.
The naval action failed and was never tried again. And then another minister sent his armies ashore at Gallipoli, and they fought bravely.
The landing at Gallipoli quickly turned into a murderous standoff. British, Australian, and Allied forces suffered over 250,000 casualties. The Conservatives and the public blamed Churchill. He resigned from the Navy even before the surviving troops were evacuated.
One of the lowest points of his career was the Dardanelles. In fact, his wife said that she feared that he was in such a black depression that she thought he might commit suicide at that point.
In despair, he re-entered the war the only way he could. He enlisted and served as lieutenant colonel for the 6th Royal Scots Fusiliers on the Western Front.
He was the only politician of his stature who actually served in the trenches during World War I. And he had tackled it with his usual energy. He fought the lice, he fought the mud. He had all sorts of ideas about how they should approach trench warfare. It gave him a real insight for what it was like to be a soldier at the front during that war.
After almost 6 months in the trenches, Churchill returned to London and politics. He was lucky to have survived. The First World War killed millions. Over the next 2 decades, as Europe recovered and rebuilt, Churchill bounced in and out of office, switched back to the Conservative Party, wrote history books, and took up painting. But his once bright future had dimmed. He still spoke out on foreign affairs, especially when Hitler's Germany began to rearm. The war-weary British government paid little attention, but the public began to listen.
Churchill was an astonishingly brave man, both physically and morally. Churchill did believe, although he didn't like war, he'd seen enough of it not to like it, but he did believe that there were occasions when the British had to go to war, when they had to stand up to continental tyrants.
In May 1940, that moment arrived. Hitler was sweeping through Europe after swatting Neville Chamberlain aside. Churchill, the washed-up political has-been, was suddenly Britain's new prime minister, and he faced staggering odds. Hostility from his own war cabinet, a looming Nazi invasion, and pressure to negotiate with Nazi Germany. Britain's future had never looked more bleak, nor Hitler more invincible.
The real question was, could Britain make some sort of terms with Hitler which would be acceptable to the British people? There was considerable pressure on Britain, including from the United States, to come to some sort of agreement.
While the world waited for Churchill's answer, some 400,000 British troops were fighting desperately in France, Germany's latest victim. Panzer tank units pushed the British toward the coast. If killed or captured, their loss would leave England defenseless against a German invasion. Haunted by visions of the Dardanelles disaster in the last war, a grim Winston Churchill ordered an evacuation from the coastal town of Dunkirk, expecting less than 10% of the men to be rescued.
In 1940, Hitler came very close to winning the Second World War. There was only one man who stood in his way, and this was Churchill. His crucial day was when Dunkirk had only begun, and when he said, "No matter what happens at Dunkirk, we'll fight on."
He truly believed that he was the man of the hour, and he alone really understood what had to be done to meet the Nazi threat.
Suddenly, Hitler ordered his tank corps rolling toward Dunkirk to halt and told his Air Force, the Luftwaffe, to finish the job alone.
As far as Hitler and his generals were concerned, the British at Dunkirk were trivial. They were isolated. They could play no part in the battle for France.
For 9 days, over 700 Navy and volunteer ships and boats sailed back and forth across the 21-mile channel. They saved British and French soldiers alike, ferrying 3/4 of the men to safety instead of only 10%, as Churchill had feared.
Some 350,000 managed to get off from these beaches and get back to Britain. That's why it's called the miracle of Dunkirk. But as Churchill told the House of Commons, wars are not won by evacuations.
We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air.
Churchill's genius with words then turned defeat into a defiant call to arms.
We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
But France was on the verge of surrender. Its government had already evacuated Paris when Churchill flew to meet with Prime Minister Paul Reynaud and his cabinet on June 10th to plead with them to keep fighting.
Members of Reynaud's government, particularly Marshal Pétain, were convinced that every extra day's fighting would lead to more death and destruction, which was true, and that was true also for Britain. When Churchill said we won't surrender, he didn't say we won't suffer massive losses. Indeed, the very fact of not surrendering meant that Britain would suffer massive losses.
But Reynaud resigned in despair, and on June 16th, Marshal Pétain reached an armistice agreement with Hitler's Germany. From that moment, only 21 miles of water separated Britain from the Nazis. 2 days later, Churchill addressed a worried nation.
Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty, and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
The British people reacted to this. They said to themselves, finally somebody said, this is what we ought to hear, not only what we want to hear, what we ought to hear.
By mid-June 1940, Britain stood absolutely alone against Nazi Germany. The American government, led by Franklin Roosevelt, was officially neutral, and the Soviet Union's Joseph Stalin had signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler. Churchill knew Germany planned to invade and would probably use the defeated French fleet. Most French ships were in the Mediterranean near the port of Mers el-Kabir in the French colony of Algeria. Nearby British warships offered the French admiral in charge safe passage to British or neutral ports. But France refused.
So the moment that Britain knew that the French were not going to hand over their ships, the order was given to open fire. And some 1,200 French sailors, who only 3 weeks earlier had been Britain's allies, were killed. It was certainly the most difficult single decision Churchill made. During the war, he was physically sick. When he announced it, he broke down. He was overwhelmed by it. And what he only learned 6 months later was that it was the ruthlessness of the destruction of the French ships at Mers el-Kabir that had convinced Roosevelt and his administration that Britain really was determined to fight on, and that therefore their hesitations to send any war equipment to Britain, because they thought Britain is just going to surrender or be overrun, those hesitations were swept aside.
What General Wagner has called the Battle of France is over. The Battle of Britain is about to begin.
Unlike in France, this battle would be fought in the sky. In August 1940, the Luftwaffe set out to destroy Britain's air defense before German troops crossed the Channel. But the Royal Air Force stopped them cold, handing Hitler his first defeat.
The gratitude of every home in our island, in our empire, and indeed throughout the world, except in the abodes of the guilty, goes out to the British airmen who, undaunted by odds, unwearied in their constant challenge and mortal danger, are turning the tide of the world war by their prowess and by their devotion. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.
Hitler changed his strategy and started a new kind of attack. It was called the Blitz.
The principal aim was no longer just to destroy the Royal Air Force, which they couldn't do. He decided to bomb the cities. That this would greatly damage British morale.
Thousands of civilians were killed each week. Ultimately, close to 42,000 died. Over 50,000 were injured, and large parts of London and 6 other British cities were destroyed. But Winston Churchill's Britain remained resolute.
Churchill was able to create a mood of almost exaggerated euphoria where, against all the evidence, he persuaded the British that this was their great occasion to play a major historical role in making the world a better place by defying Hitler.
We cannot yet see how deliverance will come, or when it will come. But nothing is more certain than that every trace of Hitler's footsteps, every stain of his infected and corroding fingers will be sponged and purged, and if need be, blasted from the surface of the earth.
He authorized a number of bombing raids on German cities. This idea that we're giving it back to him, right? that we're striking back, this was what raised the morale. The wounds and the harm and the bleeding from the bombardment could not be assuaged. They couldn't be minimized. That was, I think, the great achievement of Churchill's speeches and of his policies, that we did begin to hit back, even though we didn't have the resources to do so. We hardly had the resources to defend our island.
The air raids did little damage, but they proved Britain's resolve. Hitler blinked and turned east toward his supposed ally, the Soviet Union, whose huge factories and wheat and oil fields looked ripe for conquest.
It seemed certain that Hitler would be able to defeat the Soviet Union within a few months. And once he had done so, he would have the vast resources of the Soviet Union to turn against Britain.
Churchill, and to a lesser extent Roosevelt, sent message after message to Stalin, intelligent messages, that the Germans are going to attack him. This was no secret, you know. There were 195 German divisions on the Russian frontier. You cannot hide this.
And if Hitler hadn't foolishly diverted his forces for 3 months to attack Yugoslavia and Greece, he would almost certainly have destroyed the Soviet Union. He was caught in the end because those 3 months pushed him into winter, and fighting in Russia in winter is not good news for any invader, as Napoleon had discovered in 1812.
Along with the terrible Russian winter, Soviet troops fought to the death. And Russian civilians practiced a scorched earth policy, leaving only smoldering ruins for the advancing German army.
It's hard for Americans to believe this, even today, that Hitler's attack on Russia, in the long run, turned to be more important even than Pearl Harbor, than America's entry into the war. Because Hitler and the Germans were so powerful that without Russia, Britain and the United States could not have defeated Germany. Churchill knew that from the beginning.
Churchill hated Bolshevism and communism from the time of the Bolshevik Revolution on in 1917. And yet Churchill once made an observation that if Hitler had invaded hell, he would immediately seek an alliance with the devil. And I suppose in some senses he probably thought an alliance with Stalin was pretty close to that. But any help that Churchill could get to defeat Hitler, he was glad to have and glad to welcome and willing to work with.
So from the moment of the German invasion of the Soviet Union, it became a British imperative to do everything possible to somehow keep the Soviet Union fighting. Even as the Germans were sweeping through Russia, Britain was sending its own vital supplies, manufactured in the United States, aircraft, tanks, guns. They would come across the Atlantic and be transshipped at Liverpool immediately to the Soviet Union.
Churchill was able to help Stalin only because he had persuaded Roosevelt to aid Britain, despite American neutrality.
Churchill had a very complicated relationship with FDR. He knew that American involvement in the war was essential, and before the United States came in, he did everything within his power to woo Roosevelt to his side. In fact, he said no lover had ever studied the whims of his mistress the way that he studied FDR.
He was rebuffed more often than he got satisfaction, but he got satisfaction sufficiently to go on asking. And sometimes he would put the matter to Roosevelt very starkly, very severely, and would say, unless you're prepared to help us try to survive the German onslaught, try not to surrender, unless you do that, you will in the end be the victims. This is about you, because Hitler is not simply interested in dominating Europe.
Churchill convinced Roosevelt, who was still neutral, to directly aid the Soviet Union and send everything from field hospitals to tanks to barbed wire.
Even so, it was a close-run thing. In December 1941, the Germans were within a few hours of overrunning Moscow.
Halfway around the world, another attack began. On December 7th, Japan's air raid on Pearl Harbor jolted America out of its neutrality. 4 days after the attack, Japan's ally, Nazi Germany, declared war on the United States. Churchill was thrilled. America would have to fight Hitler. The tide of war began to change in late 1942, with Allied victories in North Africa and Stalingrad.
The alliance that won the war was between Britain and Russia and the United States. It was an extraordinary alliance of three nations who didn't have all that much in common except the desire to beat Hitler and latterly the desire to beat Japan. Churchill played a very large part in holding that alliance together. There's a sense in which he is the man who invented shuttle diplomacy.
Churchill, who was the oldest of the three, made these enormous journeys. And he wasn't well. He'd had a stroke, he'd been very ill in the middle of the war, but he went on traveling.
And there isn't any doubt, I think, that that was one of the greatest things he did in the Second World War.
It was only as the war went on that it became evident that Britain was beginning to be exhausted and only a junior partner of the United States. However, his prestige was such that he was still a major figure till the end of the war.
The greatest war the world had yet known ended in 1945. But the sweet taste of victory was soon replaced by growing tension between the Allies. Poland, whose occupation by Germany had started World War II, ended the war still occupied by foreign troops. Soviet troops.
The liberation came with the Red Army, But the Red Army brought with it this terrifying political control, establishing in 8 different countries communist regimes. Now, the idea was that Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin would sit down, as they did eventually sit down, first at Tehran and then at Yalta, and would agree that democracy should be restored. And this Stalin had no intention of doing.
The hot war settled into Cold War rivalry between communism and capitalism, the Soviet Union and the United States. Churchill's Britain would find itself playing only a minor part. Throughout World War II, Churchill had claimed, "We shall defend our island whatever the cost may be." He was equally outspoken about preserving the British Empire, but the cost of defending the island of Britain was its empire.
And Churchill knew, and he was not unaware of the ironies of this, that the price of an alliance with Russia and with America, an alliance that was necessary to beat Hitler, was that in the end Russia and America would supersede Britain as a great power, and that in 1945 is exactly what they did.
Churchill would ultimately outlive both Roosevelt and Stalin, but not the post-war world they created.
Churchill was unlucky in a way to live too long. He once said, when he was in his 80s, and very frail, but mentally very alert, he said, "My life is over, but not yet ended." And sometimes looking back, he wondered what it was he'd achieved.
There was a sense in which Churchill's magnificent state funeral in early 1965 was not only the last rites of Churchill as a great man, but the requiem for Britain as a great power, and everybody really knew that.
Losing the empire was inevitable, but saving the world from tyrants was not. It took courage, a mixture of compassion and ruthlessness, a deep understanding of history, and the ability to express those qualities in words. In a 1950 speech, Churchill said, "The day may dawn when fair play, love for one's fellow man, respect for justice and freedom will enable tormented generations to march forth, serene and triumphant, from the hideous and haunted epoch in which we ourselves have to dwell. Meanwhile, never flinch, never weary, never despair."